The Food Safety Modernization Act Produce Safety Rule as compared to produce safety audit programs. Whether we're talking about the Food Safety Modernization Act Produce Safety Rule or produce safety audit programs, the goal of these regulations and programs respectively is to minimize the potential introduction of hazards into produce. On a high level, there are three categories of hazards that can lead to a foodborne illness or injury. The first category are physical hazards. These are things like glass, metal, bone, etc., that may inadvertently end up in food and cause injury to a person's mouth or digestive tract if eaten. The second category are chemical hazards. This includes allergens. The big 9 allergens in the United States are milk, eggs, peanuts, tree nuts, fish, shellfish, wheat, soy, and sesame. Chemical hazards also include aflatoxins that are relevant to peanuts and tree nuts, as well as chemicals you are using for cleaning and sanitation, pest management, fertigation, etc. The last category of hazards are the biological hazards, which includes microorganisms that cause foodborne illnesses or intoxications. The Food Safety Modernization Act Produce Safety Rule has requirements for the mitigation of biological hazards. Many produce safety audit programs have requirements for physical and chemical hazards, but the major emphasis of these programs focuses on managing biological hazards as well. The biological hazards associated with foods are microorganisms that cause disease in humans. The field of microbiology includes diverse organisms from different domains of life. Not all microorganisms are pathogens, i.e. bad, and microorganisms collectively, that these organisms that we cannot see, are vital for biological cycles here on Earth. Microorganisms are important in a number of fields, including medicine, agriculture, and the chemical and food industries. However, we're not here to discuss beneficial microorganisms. In terms of produce safety, we're focused on the types of these microorganisms that can make people sick. There are certain types of microorganisms that pose a health risk, and some of these are the causative agents of foodborne illnesses. Multiple terms are used to describe a sickness that arises from consuming a contaminated food or beverage, and they are listed here for reference. There is no one syndrome that encompasses all foodborne illnesses. Typical symptoms often associated with a foodborne illness are nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. However, there are many other symptoms that can be associated with a foodborne illness. The majority of microorganisms that cause produce outbreaks are classified collectively as enteric microorganisms. This means they are found in the intestine of humans or animals. Many are also considered to be zoonotic, meaning they can infect both animals and humans. Often, the infected animal may not have any disease symptoms present when they have an infection. However, when they shed these pathogens in feces or other body secretions, if a human is exposed, they can develop what is often a severe illness. There is a history of pathogens in animals being associated together and animal food products being tied to outbreaks. Examples include Shiga toxin-producing Escherichia coli or E. coli associated with cattle and beef products, as well as Salmonella being associated with poultry and their meat and eggs. However, we now know that these animals, as well as other domesticated animals and wildlife, including us humans, can shed these pathogens into the environment. This can lead to cross-contamination of other food types, including fruits, vegetables, and tree nuts. The next few slides were developed by the Produce Safety Alliance and are part of the Standardized Food Safety Modernization Act, or FSMA Produce Safety Rule training curriculum. The statistics shown here are on produce-related outbreaks from 1996 to 2014, and it's meant to illustrate the diversity of commodities that have been associated with outbreaks. Fruits, vegetables, and tree nuts have been associated with outbreaks caused by pathogenic foodborne pathogens. Therefore, the FSMA Produce Safety Rule and most produce safety audits extend to a wide variety of commodities with the aim to minimize the risk of these microbial pathogens being introduced during the production, harvesting, and post-harvest handling of specialty crops. Fresh produce is often consumed raw and does not undergo a processing or kill step that would destroy pathogens that may be on the produce. Contamination events are often sporadic, and microorganisms are too small to be seen by the naked eye, and this makes it difficult to know when a contamination event has occurred. Additionally, the number of these organisms are often very low when contamination does occur, and this makes it difficult to detect pathogens through product testing. Finally, the surface of produce is complex, and microorganisms can enter small structures or crevices on produce that can protect them from removal by any post-contamination intervention, such as washing. Because it can be challenging to detect contamination and it is nearly impossible to remove pathogens once a contamination event has occurred, produce safety regulations and produce safety audit schemes focus on known sources of pathogens and practices that will reduce the risk of these sources leading to pathogen contamination of produce. This slide shows the sources of microbial pathogens that have been linked through outbreak investigations or research to lead to cross-contamination of produce with pathogens. The sources that are known to introduce pathogens in produce production and post-harvest environments are humans, soil and soil amendments, animals, water, and buildings, equipment, and tools. The Food Safety Modernization Act, or FSMA, was the largest overhaul we've seen in our food safety regulations in the U.S. in quite some time. Overall, FSMA shifted the focus of food safety regulation to prevention of foodborne illness. This timeline is just meant to give you a general overview of the evolution of food safety regulations over time. You can see all these regulations are focused on processed foods. However, with FSMA, we have the first federally mandated food safety regulation that applies to produce production, harvesting, and post-harvest handling. This is due to the outbreaks that have been observed in produce over the last 20 years. Prior to FSMA, good agricultural practices, or GAPs, set a framework for managing produce safety, as well as many industry-driven standards and produce safety audit programs. We'll talk about all these things in this presentation. FSMA is an overarching regulation that covers the entire food supply chain. To implement FSMA, 7 foundational rules were established. We are here to talk about the foundational rule that applies to produce directly, the Produce Safety Rule. The FSMA Produce Safety Rule is the first federal food safety regulation that applies to the growing, harvesting, packing, and holding of vegetables, fruits, and tree nuts. The Produce Safety Rule is based on the current scientific understanding of the point sources and transmission routes that lead to the contamination of specialty crops with foodborne pathogens. The focus of the Produce Safety Rule is on minimizing the risk of contamination of produce. The Produce Safety Rule focuses on key areas with known contributions to previous documented produce outbreaks, as well as research on produce safety. These areas include worker health, hygiene, and training, biological soil amendments of animal origin, domesticated and wild animals, as well as adjacent land use, agricultural water, and equipment, buildings, and post-harvest handling. The Produce Safety Rule sets food safety standards that, when in comparison to many food safety audit schemes, are considered to be minimal. The Produce Safety Rule has specific requirements around the 5 areas listed here to mitigate food safety risk and requires documentation of the standard operating procedures, monitoring, and verification procedures to show compliance with the regulatory standard. Additionally, the Produce Safety Rule requires that at least one person in the farming operation attend the Produce Safety Alliance Grower Training course. An on-farm inspection to verify regulatory compliance will be conducted by the FDA or State Department of Agriculture to verify regulatory compliance. Audits are non-regulatory. They are required to show a buyer that a grower is meeting a set of food safety standards. A second-party audit may be conducted by an employee of a buyer to assess a grower's food safety processes and systems. In contrast, a third-party audit is conducted by an independent and accredited audit organization that is not associated with the farm or the buyer. Depending on the scale of your operations and the market access you want to achieve, you may be subject to both a second and a third-party audit. Third-party audits are by far most common. Second-party audits are commonly used routinely by large-scale buyers. Second-party audits may also be used for smaller-scale buyers that do not wish their growers to pay the costs associated with a third-party audit, but this is rare. Often, your direct buyer may be subject to audit requirements incurred by those upstream to them in the supply chain. It's always good to have a clear understanding of the food safety audit requirements when engaging in conversations with prospective buyers. The cost of the audit will fall to the producer in the majority of cases. This slide is meant to convey the basic difference between food safety audits and a produce safety rule inspection. Audits are a way to demonstrate to buyers that you meet the requirements of a food safety audit scheme. Audits are voluntary, meaning you don't have to do them, but are likely necessary for market access. There is a fee to you for the audit. Audits are typically conducted annually and confirm compliance with a food safety standard, and in some cases, the audit criteria will align with the technical requirements of the FSMA Produce Safety Rule. Results of audits are based on a scoring system, and a pass-fail grade will be determined following the audit. In contrast, inspections are a way to demonstrate to federal and state regulators that you are complying with the requirements of the FSMA Produce Safety Rule. They are mandatory for farms covered by the Produce Safety Rule. There is no cost for an inspection, and there is no prescribed frequency of inspection. Typically, inspections will be more frequent if a farm has recurrent findings, meaning they are out of compliance with requirements of the Produce Safety Rule. Inspections are conducted by a regulatory inspector to confirm compliance with the regulatory requirements. This could be an inspector from the FDA or an inspector from the State Department of Agriculture who has credentials from the FDA to conduct the inspection on the federal agency's behalf. Documentation of inspection will be provided to a farm, and significant deficiencies or findings will be recorded and require a correction and re-inspection in some cases. Hopefully, the general differences between audits and the FSMA Produce Safety Rule requirements are now clear. Now we will transition to talk more specifically about produce safety audits. Audit schemes or programs are often benchmarked against standards of standards established by coalitions between industry, regulators, and academics. 3 of these standards of standards or benchmarking food safety entities are outlined here. The Global Food Safety Initiative, or GFSI, is a global food industry organization that creates and implements food safety benchmark framework. It covers all aspects of the food supply chain. Many certification programs or audit schemes are benchmarked against GFSI. The Leafy Greens Marketing Agreement, or LGMA, was farmer-initiated after the 2007 outbreak of E. coli 0157H7 in spinach. It is a collaboration between farmers, shippers, processors, scientists, and government officials to establish parameters for establishing a food safety system to reduce contamination during the production of leafy vegetables. The USDA Harmonized Gap Initiative was driven by industry in collaboration with government agencies and audit organizations to align a standardized food safety standard and checklists for pre- and post-harvest produce operations. We will talk about which audit schemes are benchmarked against these standards, but it is important to know which standard your buyer requires in order to select the correct audit scheme. These are the most common types of audits that would be required of growers. These include those covered under the umbrella of USDA GAAP audit services. These include good agricultural practices, good manufacturing practices, harmonized GAAP plus, commodity specific audits, as well as LGMA audits and group GAAP audits. Other common produce safety audits include Primus GFS and Global GAAP. We'll talk about each of these in a bit more detail. Here you can see which audits are benchmarked against specific standards of standards. The benchmarking standard is on the left and the type of audit is in the colored box. A buyer may tell you a specific audit scheme or a benchmarking standard in which they want the audit to be benchmarked against. It is important to get clarity from the buyer on which audit is required before investing time and money into preparing and scheduling the audit. The USDA GAAP audit is the most basic of the produce safety audit schemes. It's based on FDA recognized best practices for produce safety management. However, it does not cover all the technical requirements of the FSMA Produce Safety Rule. A GAAP audit is often a good place to start for small producers and may be acceptable to access some markets. Specific information on what is covered in the audit and an audit checklist is available on the USDA's website. During the audit, the checklist guides the audit and scores are assigned based on the practice observed. And 80% of all total points is considered a passing score. There are certain conditions that pose a high risk that may result in an automatic unsatisfactory score, which is a non-pass. A logo is available that can be used for those that pass a GAAP audit to enhance marketing of their products. These audits are conducted by a USDA licensed auditor, which is usually someone from the USDA Agricultural Marketing Service or from a state Department of Agriculture. GAAP audits cover a farm's food safety program, which includes worker health and hygiene, training, on-farm practices such as water use, sewage, animals, biological soil amendments of animal origin, and traceability. It also covers harvesting activities such as managing sanitation of harvesting tools and equipment and harvest crew hygiene practices. Additionally, it covers post-harvest operations such as packing house general housekeeping, cleaning and sanitation of packing lines and wash stations, pest control programs, worker health and hygiene, and product traceability. It also will cover storage and transportation activities such as containers and pallets and produce storage. It extends to ice and refrigeration units, transportation, and of course, worker health, hygiene, and traceability as it pertains to post-harvest operations. USDA audits now all incorporate preventive food defense procedures, which are policies that are in place to keep people from impacting the safety of foods intentionally or unintentionally, i.e., keeping them from adulterating food products. This includes policies on visitors and employees' access to the farm and packing facilities, as well as how these facilities are protected from intrusions. These tables show crops that are generally covered by GAAP auditing services and those that are not covered by GAAP audits. Generally, all specialty crops can be covered by a GAAP audit. If you are growing sprouts, there are more rigorous food safety practices that must be in place to properly manage their safe production. Sprouts are not covered by a basic GAAP audit. Sprouts also have specific requirements under the FSMA Produce Safety Rule and require training conducted by the Sprout Safety Alliance. These enhanced requirements are due to the high incidence of foodborne outbreaks associated with sprouts. A USDA Good Manufacturing Practice or GMP audit is an audit service for produce distribution centers. It replaces the Good Handling Practice or GHP audit. This could be a useful audit for produce aggregators, i.e. food hubs. The audit will focus on people's, premises, processes, products, and procedures that would mitigate food safety risks. The audits are performed by USDA or state regulators. All USDA audits have fees that are based on an hourly rate. This hourly rate not only includes the time the auditor spends on your farm or in your facility, but the time required for them to travel to your site. For the GMP audit, the standard as well as an audit checklist are available on the USDA's website. USDA Group Gap is a mechanism for a group to obtain GAP or GHP audit certification. The group collectively will adopt a food safety quality management system, or QMS, that outlines food safety practices for the entire group aligning with either the GAP or GHP audit requirements. The group then agrees to be audited as one body. Unique to this program, an internal audit is a requirement, and a qualified member of the group will audit all entities within that group. USDA or state auditors will then perform an annual audit of a represented sample of the group's production locations. This can be a more cost-effective mechanism for a group of smaller farms or produce distribution centers to obtain an audit certification. I won't read through all of this, but the QMS or quality management system that must be developed for a group gap audit requires many details about each farm or distribution center included in the group. It outlines the specific roles of each entity, how the group will be communicating between each other, the qualifications of the individual developing and managing the QMS, the qualifications of the individual conducting the internal audit, and the audit scheme to be used, either GAP or GMP. The QMS must be documented and records on implementation of the QMS must be maintained. Records associated with product realization are those specifically related to the implemented audit scheme, GAP or GMP practices. Neither the basic GAP or GMP audit covers all the technical provisions of the FSMA Produce Safety Rule. However, those that are prepared for and pass a USDA GAP or GMP audit will be implementing a food safety system, and with some additional components, such as attending a PSA grower training course, conducting a pre-harvest ag water assessment, creating additional records of biological soil amendment use, and a few other things, these individuals should have no problems adhering to the regulatory standard. USDA Harmonized GAP and USDA Harmonized GAP Plus audits are the most comprehensive audits the USDA Agricultural Marketing Service offers. Both are aligned with the technical provisions of the FSMA Produce Safety Rule. Both also align with the Produce Safety Gap Harmonization Initiative. If you go through one of these audits, it will cover all the components that would be covered during a regulatory inspection for the Produce Safety Rule. The USDA Harmonized GAP Plus audit is benchmarked to GFSI. This means it can meet buyer requirements that have a GFSI benchmarked audit. Again, it's important to understand the type of audit a buyer requires and select the appropriate audit based on that requirement. Here's an overview of the USDA audits and whether they meet GFSI benchmarks, align with the FSMA Produce Safety Rule, whether they align with the Produce Gap Harmonization Initiative, and whether they adhere to FDA and industry produce safety best practices. USDA Harmonized GAP Plus audits cover all of these areas. Audits will cost the producer money. The USDA audit services are based on an hourly rate. The hours include time spent on your property as well as time for travel to the site and time for additional processing if needed. A flat fee is also assessed for audit verification services, and if going through a Harmonized GAP Plus audit, a certification fee for GFSI is also assessed. The fee will fluctuate based on your circumstances, but anticipate a minimum of at least $1,000 for one of these audits, and it can go much higher depending on the scale of the operation and the location. Leafy Green Marketing Agreement or LGMA audits are specific to growers of leafy greens. The LGMA is an industry-led initiative that spurred out of the 2007 spinach outbreak. The standard was developed between a collaboration with industry, academics, and regulatory experts in leafy green safety. This is a robust audit program with very specific practices and standards that must be adopted for alignment with the LGMA. LGMA requirements are often updated as new data is derived related to the safety management for the production during the production of leafy greens. These boxes outline some of the key areas the LGMA has requirements for. LGMA audits align with GFSI and the Harmonized Gap Initiative, as well as cover the technical requirements under the FSMA Produce Safety Rule. Primus GFS audits are another audit scheme common in the produce industry, often required by larger scale buyers to show adherence to robust food safety standards. The farm or produce distribution center being audited determines the scope of the audit based on their practices. The modules allow for selection of food safety audit schemes that are more specific to the operation. Primus GFS audits align with GFSI and the Harmonized Gap Initiative, as well as cover the technical requirements under the FSMA Produce Safety Rule. The last produce safety audit I'll mention are global gap audits. This is a globally recognized produce safety audit scheme, so relevant to those selling internationally. It is GFSI and Harmonized Gap Initiative benchmark. It can also cover the technical requirements of the FSMA Produce Safety Rule upon request. Many growers want to know, do I need to do microbial testing to meet requirements set forth by the Produce Safety Rule regulation or by produce safety audit schemes? The answer is it's complicated and it depends. This table is based on the most common audit schemes, and testing may or may not be required based on the risk analysis you will conduct as you prepare for the audit. The FSMA Produce Safety Rule does not require testing pre-harvest water or product. The Produce Safety Rule requires documentation of the validated treatment processes for treated biological soil amendments of animal origin, and testing results may be included as part of this documentation verifying proper treatment. Basic USDA, GAP, and GMP, as well as group GAP audits don't require testing unless a risk has been identified that would warrant it. The other produce safety audit schemes, Harmonized Gap Plus, LGMA, Primus GFS, and Global Gap, do require testing of pre-harvest agricultural water and likely other testing, including soil or product, if high food safety risks are identified during the risk assessment. There are audits that align with the technical provisions of the FSMA Produce Safety Rule regulation by their design. These include USDA Harmonized Gap Plus, USDA Harmonized Gap, LGMA, Primus GFS, and Global Gap. That means if you are prepared for one of these produce safety audits, that you will also be prepared for an inspection by a regulatory body. Going through an audit does not replace an inspection. If you are covered by the FSMA Produce Safety Rule, your farm is subject to inspection by a regulatory body to confirm compliance with the regulation. While a basic gap audit doesn't specifically align with all the technical requirements of the FSMA Produce Safety Rule, you will have a great head start in meeting a majority of the regulatory requirements. To close, I want to emphasize that inspections are not audits. Inspections for the FSMA Produce Safety Rule are conducted by federal and state regulators to verify compliance with food safety regulations. Audits are voluntary and conducted by a licensed auditor. Audits are required to expand market access, as most buyers have requirements for some type of produce safety audit. Overall, the goal is to ensure produce is safe and healthy for consumption. Both the regulatory requirements and produce safety audit schemes are built on principles to help mitigate the risk of foodborne outbreaks caused by contaminated produce.